Good evening, and welcome to Dream History. You can get comfortable now. Take one slow, calm breath and allow today to gently fade away. Now we can begin. Get comfortable now and allow your body to settle into stillness, because this story does not begin with power or conquest, and it does not begin with names remembered by history, but instead opens quietly at ground level in the slow, early light of an ordinary morning somewhere within the vast lands of the Achaemenid world, where most people would never see a palace, never speak to an official of high rank, and never think of themselves as living inside an empire at all, because life here is understood not through borders or rulers, but through routine, work, and the simple need to endure another day. You may take a slow breath and imagine the first sounds of movement beginning long before the sun fully rises, as doors made from wood and reed are opened carefully, as feet step onto packed earth floors still cool from the night, and as families begin to stir not from choice or ambition, but because daylight governs labor, and labor governs survival. This is ancient Persia as most people experienced it, not as an idea or a spectacle, but as a lived environment where fields, courtyards, workshops, and narrow paths matter far more than imperial ambition, and where the presence of the state is felt only indirectly, through obligations that return each year in predictable forms, rather than through constant force or visible authority. Across these lands, stretching from dry plateaus to river valleys and mountain foothills, ordinary people begin their days in remarkably similar ways, adjusting their movements to climate and light, measuring time by the sun rather than by clocks, and organizing their lives around tasks that must be completed regardless of who rules far away, because grain must be grown, water must be managed, and households must be sustained through repetition rather than change. In the early morning air, before heat settles heavily onto the land, work begins quietly, as some prepare tools worn smooth by years of use, others tend to animals kept close to the household, and many move toward fields or irrigation channels that demand constant attention, since water in this world is never assumed to be plentiful, and access to it defines both comfort and risk. Most people living under Achaemenid rule are farmers or laborers whose daily concerns are intensely local, shaped by soil conditions, rainfall, and the reliability of canals or qanats that bring life into otherwise dry ground. And while these systems are maintained within a broader imperial framework, they are experienced on a human scale, through the repeated physical effort of digging, clearing, repairing, and waiting. For these people, the empire exists less as a symbol and more as a background structure that records, counts, and redistributes, appearing in the form of measured rations, assigned labor, or scheduled obligations that arrive without drama and depart without ceremony, leaving behind the familiar rhythm of household life. Inside small settlements and scattered villages, families organize themselves around shared space rather than privacy, gathering within mud-brick houses built for function rather than comfort, where courtyards provide light and air, flat roofs serve practical purposes, and furniture remains minimal because daily life unfolds close to the ground, on woven mats and packed earth, with possessions limited to what can be repaired and reused. Here, the household is not merely a place of rest, but the central unit of production and responsibility, where men, women, and children contribute according to age and ability, and where authority flows through established hierarchies that feel natural rather than imposed, reinforced by habit rather than explanation. Children grow into labor early, learning by watching rather than instruction, carrying water, assisting with food preparation, or tending animals, while elders remain present within the household not as retirees, but as sources of memory and practical knowledge, helping to guide decisions that ensure stability rather than progress. As the morning advances, movement increases across paths connecting homes to fields, workshops, and water sources, creating a quiet circulation of bodies that feels repetitive and unremarkable to those within it, yet forms the true engine of imperial endurance, because it is through these countless ordinary movements that grain is grown, goods are produced, and obligations are met. There is little sense of personal advancement here, and little expectation that life will become fundamentally different over time, because change arrives slowly and unpredictably, while repetition offers reliability, and so most people invest their energy not in transformation, but in maintaining balance between effort and exhaustion. The sounds of this world are subdued and practical, consisting of tools striking earth, grain being ground, water moving through channels, and voices kept low in shared spaces, as excessive noise carries little value in a life governed by necessity rather than display. Smells drift gently through these spaces as well, blending baked bread, dust, animal pens, and oil lamps into a familiar background that signals continuity rather than novelty, reinforcing the sense that today resembles yesterday closely enough to feel secure. As sunlight strengthens, the boundaries of the day become clearer, with work paced to avoid the worst heat, movements adjusted to conserve energy, and pauses taken when possible, not for leisure but for preservation, because physical endurance defines the limits of daily action. Throughout this world, diversity of language, custom, and local practice exists naturally, yet daily life remains remarkably uniform in structure, shaped by the same fundamental needs for food, water, shelter, and cooperation, which bind communities together more strongly than imperial identity ever could. What unites these people is not ideology or loyalty, but participation in systems that reward predictability and punish neglect, where missing a planting window, failing to maintain irrigation, or mismanaging stored grain can carry consequences that reach far beyond a single season. And so, as the morning continues to unfold across distant regions connected only loosely by administration, the ordinary Persian world moves forward quietly, driven not by ambition but by obligation,
not by spectacle, but by routine, and not by dreams of expansion, but by the steady requirement to endure, to repeat, and to remain balanced within a landscape that offers little forgiveness for error. For a moment, allow yourself to rest within this rhythm, to feel the slow certainty of a day that does not promise excitement or resolution, but offers something more stable and more essential, the knowledge that life continues not because it is extraordinary, but because it is carefully maintained, one ordinary morning at a time.
As the day moves forward beyond its quiet beginning, attention naturally turns away from individual movement and toward the land itself, because for ordinary people living across the Achaemenid world, the environment is not a background to life, but its most persistent and unavoidable frame, shaping every decision long before anyone considers authority, belief, or identity. You may take another slow breath and imagine the way terrain changes gradually rather than suddenly, as dry plateaus stretch outward under a wide sky. River valleys cut narrow lines of fertility through otherwise harsh ground, and mountain zones rise into cooler air where travel slows and resources thin, creating a landscape that demands constant adaptation rather than mastery. In many regions, water defines the boundary between survival and collapse, because rainfall is irregular, rivers unpredictable, and soil often unwilling to cooperate, requiring human effort not to dominate nature, but simply to hold it in balance long enough for crops to grow. For ordinary households, this means that daily life is shaped less by choice than by constraint, as planting schedules, work intensity, and even movement are organized around seasonal patterns that return each year with little variation, yet never with full reliability. The heat that settles over much of this world does not arrive as a dramatic force, but as a steady presence that limits endurance, encouraging early rising, measured labor, and long pauses during the brightest hours, when the body demands rest not as comfort, but as necessity. In drier zones, fields cluster wherever irrigation channels, or qanats, bring water from distant sources, transforming otherwise barren ground into narrow strips of productivity that must be maintained continuously, because neglect quickly returns them to dust. These systems require cooperation rather than individual effort, drawing households into shared responsibility for clearing channels, repairing walls, and regulating flow, since water taken too freely by one group threatens the survival of others, reinforcing a quiet social discipline rooted in environmental reality rather than imposed law. Even in river valleys where fertility appears more generous, floods and fluctuations create their own risks, demanding careful timing and experience to avoid loss, so that knowledge of the land becomes a form of inheritance passed through observation rather than instruction, embedded in habit and memory rather than written rules.
Across such diverse regions, the empire does not impose a single way of life because the land itself refuses uniformity, forcing local adaptation that shapes diet, housing, labor intensity, and even social interaction, making everyday existence deeply regional despite administrative unity. For the ordinary person, this diversity is not abstract, but felt directly through the weight of tools suited to local soil, the texture of grain varieties that grow reliably, and the daily calculation of effort against available water and energy. climate also shapes emotional life quietly, encouraging caution rather than optimism, because long experience teaches that favorable conditions cannot be assumed, and that preparation matters more than expectation. As seasons pass, households learn to read subtle signals in wind, temperature, and soil moisture, adjusting routines incrementally rather than dramatically, since sudden change often brings risk rather than opportunity. The rhythm of life therefore stretches and contracts with the year, tightening during planting and harvest periods, loosening during times of waiting or maintenance, creating cycles that repeat often enough to feel familiar, yet remain uncertain enough to demand attention. This constant negotiation with land and climate leaves little space for abstraction, grounding thought firmly in the present, where success is measured not by accumulation or progress, but by the ability to carry household needs through another seasonal turn. In such conditions, innovation is cautious and slow, because untested methods threaten stability, and most people prefer reliable repetition over uncertain improvement, especially when mistakes can mean hunger or debt. The physical environment also shapes settlement patterns, encouraging smaller, dispersed communities where land allows, or tighter clustering where water access is limited, reinforcing social structures that prioritize cooperation over isolation. Paths connecting fields, canals, and homes are worn smooth by daily use, becoming extensions of routine rather than markers of movement, as people traverse the same routes repeatedly, measuring distance not in units of space, but in effort and time. As daylight advances, shadows shorten and heat deepens, subtly guiding activity without instruction, reminding bodies when to slow and when to resume, so that the land itself becomes a silent organizer of daily behavior. Within this system, the presence of the state remains indirect, visible mainly in how resources are counted and obligations scheduled, yet even these processes must adapt to environmental limits, since grain cannot be collected before it exists, and labor cannot be demanded when survival tasks take priority. Thus, for ordinary people, empire feels less like control and more like an additional layer within an already demanding natural order, one that records and redistributes but rarely interferes with the fundamental relationship between human effort and land response. As afternoon approaches, work tapers naturally, not because tasks are complete, but because the body recognizes limits imposed by climate, reinforcing a daily pattern that values endurance over intensity. In this way, land and climate quietly teach restraint, patience, and attentiveness, shaping lives that move steadily rather than dramatically, and ensuring that survival depends not on strength or ambition, but on consistency and careful adjustment. For a moment, allow yourself to feel this slow pressure of environment on daily existence, where the land does not demand reverence or fear, but constant respect, and where ordinary life unfolds not in defiance of nature, but in careful alignment with it, day after day, season after season, without pause or promise of relief.
As the limits of land and climate quietly set the outer boundaries of daily life, the focus naturally narrows toward the places where ordinary people actually spend most of their time, because villages and small towns are not merely locations on a map. Across much of the Achaemenid world, the majority of people live not in large cities or administrative centers, but in rural settlements tied directly to nearby fields, irrigation channels, grazing areas, and seasonal paths, forming communities that exist primarily to support food production and household survival. These villages are rarely planned in advance, instead growing gradually as families build near usable land and water, resulting in irregular layouts where houses cluster loosely around courtyards, wells, canals, or paths, reflecting practical relationships rather than aesthetic order. For ordinary people, distance matters not as geography but as effort, so homes are placed close enough to fields to reduce wasted movement, while still allowing space for animals, storage, and shared work areas, creating settlements that feel compact without being dense. In many regions, towns emerge only where trade routes, administrative needs, or water access justify them, and even then, they remain small by later standards, serving primarily as local centers for markets, workshops, and record-keeping, rather than as places of residence for most people. Within these towns, ordinary inhabitants often live on the edges rather than the center, close enough to participate in exchange, yet still tied to agricultural rhythms, reinforcing the idea that urban life does not replace rural dependence, but merely layers additional activity onto it. The built environment reflects limited resources, with structures made from mud brick, packed earth, or stone where available, materials chosen not for durability across generations, but for ease of repair, because walls will crack, roofs will erode, and maintenance is a continuous process rather than an occasional task. Streets are narrow, unpaved, and shaped by repeated use rather than planning, becoming channels for movement, animals, water runoff, and waste, all coexisting without separation, reminding residents that cleanliness and order are relative concepts shaped by environment and expectation. For ordinary households, privacy is minimal, not because it is intentionally denied, but because space is limited and shared life is unavoidable, meaning that sounds, smells, and movement pass easily between homes, reinforcing social awareness even in silence. Villages function as cooperative units, where neighbors depend on one another for labor during peak seasons, water management, and problem solving, creating social ties that are practical rather than sentimental, sustained by necessity rather than choice. Disputes over land, water, or animals are handled locally whenever possible, because distance from higher authority encourages resolution within the community, and because escalation threatens stability that everyone relies upon. In this context, leadership is informal and situational, often resting with elders, experienced farmers, or household heads whose authority comes from knowledge and reliability rather than official titles, reinforcing continuity through familiarity rather than force. The rhythm of village life is slow and repetitive, with days structured around predictable tasks that change little from year to year, allowing people to move through space almost automatically, guided by habit rather than instruction. Paths between houses, fields, and water sources become deeply familiar, worn smooth by daily passage, creating a sense of place rooted in movement rather than landmarks, where memory is stored in routine rather than narrative. Towns introduce additional layers of interaction,
such as markets, workshops, and administrative buildings. Yet for ordinary people, these spaces are visited rather than inhabited, entered for specific purposes before returning to the quieter, more controlled environment of the village. Markets operate on fixed days or seasonal schedules, drawing people together briefly before dispersing them again, reinforcing a pattern of periodic intensity followed by long stretches of routine. Within villages, animals share space with humans more closely than later societies might expect, occupying courtyards, shelters, or adjacent rooms, contributing warmth, labor, and sustenance, while also adding noise, smell, and responsibility. Storage spaces are as important as living areas because survival depends not only on production but on preservation, making granaries, jars, and sealed rooms central features of settlement design. These spaces are managed carefully, with access controlled by household heads, reflecting the importance of planning and restraint in environments where surplus is limited and loss carries serious consequences. The presence of the empire is subtle here, appearing primarily through taxation, census records, or labor obligations that reach into villages periodically rather than continuously, allowing daily life to proceed largely according to local rhythms. When officials arrive, they interact with village leaders rather than individuals, reinforcing the household and community as the basic units of administration and responsibility. Despite regional variation, a shared logic connects these settlements across the empire, emphasizing functionality, adaptability, and endurance over permanence or display, resulting in spaces that feel provisional yet stable, shaped by use rather than intention. As daylight fades and activity slows, villages settle into familiar patterns of reduced movement and sound, with people retreating into domestic spaces that offer shelter rather than comfort, marking the quiet conclusion of another day shaped less by events than by repetition. For a moment, allow yourself to rest within this ordinary space where life unfolds at ground level, measured by steps between house and field, by the weight of stored grain, and by the knowledge that tomorrow will look much like today, not because of stagnation, but because reliability is the foundation upon which survival quietly depends.
As village paths lead inward from fields and canals towards the spaces where life slows and gathers itself, the ordinary Persian house reveals itself not as a private refuge in the modern sense, but as a practical structure designed to contain work, rest, storage, and family within narrow material limits that leave little room for excess or separation. Most homes are built from mud brick shaped by hand, dried under the sun, and stacked into walls that provide insulation against heat and cold, while remaining vulnerable to erosion, requiring constant attention and repair as part of everyday responsibility rather than exceptional effort. Flat roofs stretch across these structures, serving multiple purposes at once because they protect interior spaces, provide areas for drying grain or clothing, and sometimes offer a place to sleep during hot nights when interior air becomes heavy and stagnant. The house is organized around a central courtyard whenever space allows, because light and air are precious resources in climates where heat dominates much of the year. An open space within walls creates a controlled environment where work can continue without full exposure to sun or dust.
Within this courtyard, daily life unfolds quietly as grinding grain, preparing food, mending clothing, and caring for children occur in overlapping rhythms that blur distinctions between tasks, turning the household into a continuous workspace rather than a sequence of rooms. Interior spaces are small and minimally furnished, often consisting of little more than packed earth floors, low platforms, storage jars, woven mats, and simple tools arranged along walls, reflecting a lifestyle where objects are chosen for function and durability rather than comfort or display. Furniture, as later societies would define it, is rare because sitting, working, and resting occur close to the ground, reducing the need for constructed seating while reinforcing a bodily familiarity with earth and floor that shapes posture, movement, and rest. Light enters the house indirectly through doorways or small openings, creating dim interiors where shadows dominate during most hours, encouraging activities to cluster near entrances or courtyards, and reinforcing the importance of shared spaces over isolated rooms. Cooking takes place in simple hearths or ovens built into walls or courtyards, fueled by wood, dung, or agricultural waste, producing smoke that escapes slowly and imperfectly, leaving residues that darken walls and ceilings over time, while becoming an accepted part of domestic atmosphere. Food preparation is repetitive and labor-intensive, involving grinding, kneading, baking, and boiling that must be repeated daily because preservation options are limited and meals rely on fresh preparation rather than long-term storage.
Storage spaces are integrated carefully into the home, with jars sealed against pests and moisture, baskets hung from beams, and alcoves carved into walls, reflecting a constant awareness that loss through spoilage or theft threatens household survival more than momentary discomfort. Sleeping arrangements are flexible rather than fixed, with mats and bedding laid out at night and stored during the day, allowing limited space to serve multiple purposes without permanent division, reinforcing adaptability as a domestic principle. Privacy within the household is minimal, not because intimacy is forced, but because space constraints make separation impractical, meaning that family members share sound, movement, and presence as a normal condition rather than an intrusion. Gendered use of space emerges through habit rather than architecture, as women often dominate interior and courtyard activities, while men move more frequently between house and field or workshop. Yet these patterns remain fluid, shifting according to labor demands and seasonal pressure. Children grow within this environment not as passive occupants, but as active participants whose bodies and routines adapt early to shared space, limited resources, and constant observation, learning through imitation rather than instruction. The house also functions as a site of accountability because it represents the unit through which taxes are assessed, labor obligations assigned, and administrative records maintained, making domestic space indirectly visible to the state even when officials are absent. Household heads manage resources carefully, tracking supplies, rationing food during lean periods, and coordinating labor to ensure continuity, turning the home into a small administrative system embedded within the larger imperial framework.
Repair is a constant activity, as cracks in walls are filled, roofs are patched, tools are fixed, and containers resealed, reinforcing a mindset in which maintenance is inseparable from living and neglect carries immediate consequences. Sound within the house is muted but persistent, shaped by footsteps on packed earth, the scrape of tools, the rustle of fabric, and the low voices of family members, creating an acoustic environment that remains steady rather than dramatic. Smells accumulate gradually, blending baked bread, smoke, animals, oil, and earth into a recognizable domestic atmosphere that signals familiarity rather than discomfort to those who live within it. The boundary between inside and outside is porous, as doors remain open for much of the day, allowing movement, light, and air to flow freely, while reinforcing the idea that the house is part of the village rather than separate from it. At night, as lamps are lit and activity slows, the house contracts inward, with family members gathering closer, tasks concluding, and silence settling unevenly, marking the transition from labor to rest without ceremony. Within these walls, life is not organized around individual preference or privacy, but around shared survival, repetition, and mutual dependence, creating a domestic rhythm that feels steady rather than comfortable. For a moment, let this space remain quiet around you as the day fades without announcement and the house holds its occupants gently, not as a place of escape, but as a structure designed to endure another cycle of work, rest, and return.
As domestic space quietly contains the physical reality of ordinary life, it is the family that gives this space structure and direction, because in the Achaemenid world, the household is not merely a group of related individuals living together, but the fundamental unit through which labor is organized, resources are controlled, obligations are met, and continuity is maintained across generations. Most ordinary families exist as extended households where parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes other relatives share the same living space or cluster of rooms, not out of sentiment, but because cooperation is essential for survival in environments where labor demands are high and margins are narrow. At the center of this structure stands the household head, usually the adult male, whose authority is expressed less through constant command than through responsibility for land, supplies, labor coordination, and interaction with external authorities, making leadership a practical burden rather than a symbolic privilege. This authority is reinforced by age and experience, as elders retain influence long after their physical strength declines, contributing knowledge, memory, and judgment that guide decisions about planting, storage, marriage arrangements, and conflict resolution. Women occupy a central and continuous role within the household, managing food preparation, textile production, childcare, and much of the internal economy, tasks that require constant attention and skill, and directly determine the household's ability to endure periods of scarcity. Children are integrated into this system from an early age, not as dependents awaiting maturity, but as active participants whose labor increases gradually, beginning with simple tasks such as carrying water, watching animals, or assisting with food preparation, and expanding as strength and competence develop.
The concept of childhood as a protected or separate stage of life is limited because survival depends on contribution and learning occurs through observation and repetition rather than formal instruction. Household organization follows a clear hierarchy shaped by age, gender, and role, yet this hierarchy remains flexible enough to adapt to seasonal demands, illness, or absence, allowing responsibilities to shift temporarily without challenging the underlying structure. Marriage serves primarily as an economic and social arrangement, linking households, consolidating labor resources, and ensuring continuity, rather than as an expression of individual preference, and women typically move into their husband's household, reinforcing existing family units.
Daily interactions within the household are shaped by routine rather than dialogue, as tasks are understood without explanation, and coordination occurs through familiarity, reducing the need for explicit instruction while reinforcing stability. Conflict does arise, as it must within confined spaces and sustained labor, yet it is managed quietly whenever possible, because open disruption threatens productivity and cohesion that the household relies upon. Emotional expression is restrained not by rule, but by circumstance, as exhaustion, repetition, and responsibility leave little space for sustained introspection, directing attention outward toward tasks rather than inward toward feelings. Food distribution within the household reflects hierarchy and labor contribution, with adults and workers often receiving priority during lean periods, reinforcing the practical logic that those who produce must be sustained first to ensure collective survival. The household also functions as the primary interface with the imperial system because taxes, labor obligations, and administrative records are assessed at this level rather than individually, making family organization a matter of state relevance even when officials are absent. Records preserved from administrative archives show that households are counted, measured, and categorized, with workers listed by name, age, gender, and rations, demonstrating that family structure is not invisible to the empire, but quietly integrated into its bureaucratic logic. Women and children appear in these records not as passive dependents, but as recognized laborers receiving rations for work performed, revealing a system that acknowledges contribution while maintaining hierarchy. Slavery exists within some households, yet it operates within regulated frameworks, with enslaved individuals often working alongside free family members, blurring distinctions in daily routine while maintaining legal separation. Care for the elderly, sick, or injured remains the responsibility of the household rather than any external institution, reinforcing mutual dependence and ensuring that vulnerability is managed internally rather than delegated. Ritual practices associated with family life, such as offerings or household prayers, are modest and integrated into daily routine, serving to reinforce order and continuity rather than to express emotional devotion. The household's internal rhythm mirrors the larger agricultural cycle, intensifying during planting and harvest, and slowing during periods of waiting, repair, or scarcity, creating a layered sense of time where daily repetition aligns with seasonal change. Space within the home is allocated according to function rather than personal preference,
with areas shifting purpose throughout the day as work transitions to rest and back again, reinforcing adaptability as a core domestic value. Even moments of rest occur collectively as family members sit, eat, or sleep in proximity, sharing silence as much as conversation, and reinforcing the sense that individual existence is inseparable from the group. As night settles and activity diminishes, the household contracts into stillness, holding its members within a structure shaped by labor, hierarchy, and shared responsibility, preparing quietly for another day that will follow the same familiar pattern, not because of stagnation, but because endurance depends on repetition that leaves little room for deviation.
As family structure quietly organizes responsibility and labor within the household, the passing of a single ordinary day reveals how time itself is experienced not as hours or schedules, but as a slow movement of light, heat, fatigue, and necessity that shapes every action without ever needing to be named. Before sunrise, when the air still holds a brief coolness and shadows stretch long across courtyards and paths, the household begins to stir, not through alarms or signals, but through habit, as bodies accustomed to early rising respond automatically to the returning light. There is no clear boundary between waking and working because the first movements of the day are already productive, as water is fetched, animals are checked, fires are prepared, and simple food is assembled to provide enough energy to begin labor without delay. Morning hours are valued because they offer the most tolerable conditions for physical work, especially in warmer regions, and tasks requiring strength or endurance are prioritized before the sun climbs high enough to impose limits that cannot be ignored. Men move toward fields, canals, workshops, or transport routes, depending on region and season, while women remain closer to the household, managing food preparation, textile work, childcare, and other continuous tasks that do not pause simply because external labor has begun. Children follow adults, observing and assisting where possible, absorbing routine through repetition rather than instruction, learning not through explanation, but through proximity to work that must be done, regardless of age. As the sun rises higher, movement slows naturally, not as an act of leisure, but as a necessary response to heat and exhaustion, and tasks shift toward shaded areas, interior spaces, or activities that require less physical exertion. Midday meals are simple and brief, consisting of bread, grain, vegetables, or dairy consumed quickly to sustain energy rather than to provide pleasure, because time spent eating is time not spent maintaining the household or fields. Rest during the hottest hours is pragmatic rather than indulgent, as people sit or lie in shaded courtyards, doorways, or interiors, conserving strength and waiting for conditions to improve, understanding through experience that resistance only leads to injury or collapse. During this pause, smaller tasks continue quietly, such as mending tools, repairing clothing, sorting supplies, or preparing food for later, ensuring that even rest remains productive within limits. Afternoon brings a gradual return to activity as heat softens and shadows lengthen, allowing work to resume at a measured pace, with attention turning toward tasks that must be completed before nightfall, such as closing irrigation gates, securing animals, or finishing transport. The end of daylight imposes a natural boundary that cannot be extended easily because artificial light is limited and costly, making dusk a clear signal for transition rather than an arbitrary moment. As evening approaches, movement slows and converges toward the household, with family members returning from dispersed labor to shared space, carrying tools, produce, or water gathered during the day. Evening meals are slightly more deliberate than midday ones, yet still modest, consumed collectively in courtyards or interior spaces as light fades and lamps are lit, creating a soft, contained atmosphere where conversation is minimal and fatigue dominates. Food is distributed carefully, reflecting both hierarchy and need, ensuring that those who labored most intensely receive enough to recover for the following day, reinforcing the practical logic of sustenance over equality. After eating, remaining tasks are completed quietly, including cleaning, storing supplies, feeding animals, and preparing fires or lamps as the household shifts gradually from outward labor to inward maintenance. Nightfall brings a distinct change in sensory environment as sounds diminish, visibility narrows, and movement becomes cautious, reinforcing the importance of familiarity within domestic space where pathways are known and hazards predictable. Sleep comes early not because of discipline, but because exhaustion accumulates naturally, and darkness removes incentive for continued activity, making rest an extension of necessity rather than choice. Sleeping arrangements remain flexible, with mats laid out and bodies arranged according to space, warmth, and habit, reinforcing proximity and shared vulnerability rather than isolation. Throughout the night, the household remains lightly responsive as sounds from animals, weather, or nearby movement prompt brief awakenings, reflecting an environment where complete disengagement is neither possible nor desirable. The absence of rigid schedules allows the day to feel continuous rather than segmented, as waking, working, resting, and sleeping blend into a single cycle repeated with minor variation. This rhythm persists across seasons, adapting in detail but remaining consistent in structure, teaching each generation through lived experience rather than instruction how to move with time rather than against it. For ordinary people, the value of the day lies not in achievement or progress, but in completion, as survival depends on finishing what must be done before light fades, knowing that tomorrow will demand the same measured effort once again. As the household settles into stillness and the night deepens, there is no sense of conclusion, only a pause in activity, as life rests briefly before the slow return of light signals another ordinary day shaped quietly by routine, endurance, and the unspoken understanding that stability depends on repetition more than change.
As the rhythm of a single day settles into familiarity, it becomes clear that all daily movement, effort, and fatigue ultimately serve one central purpose. Because for ordinary people in the Achaemenid world, farming is not simply an occupation among others, but the foundation upon which every aspect of life depends, shaping decisions, relationships, and survival itself. Across vast regions of the empire, Most households are directly tied to agricultural labor, whether through ownership, tenancy, or obligation, and even those engaged in crafts or transport remain dependent on the steady production of grain that sustains both body and state. Fields are modest in size, shaped by available water, soil quality, and terrain rather than ambition, and cultivated intensively because land is precious and expansion often impossible. Barley and wheat form the backbone of food production, chosen not for variety but for reliability, as these grains tolerate harsh conditions better than many alternatives, providing predictable yields when managed carefully. In southern regions, date palms supplement grain agriculture, offering fruit that can be dried, stored, and consumed throughout the year, adding calories and variety without requiring extensive processing. Farming tools remain simple and durable, consisting primarily of wooden plows reinforced with metal, sickles for harvesting, baskets for transport, and hand tools shaped to be repaired rather than replaced, reinforcing a culture of maintenance rather than consumption. Plowing is shallow by necessity, limited by soil depth and tool strength, and performed slowly with animal traction or human labor, requiring patience and repeated passes rather than speed or force. Sowing follows established patterns refined through generations of observation, with seed scattered by hand and lightly covered, relying on timing rather than technology to ensure germination. Fields demand constant attention as weeds compete for water, animals threaten crops, and irrigation channels require regular adjustment to deliver moisture without causing erosion or loss. Water management becomes as important as planting itself, because rainfall alone is unreliable in many regions, making controlled irrigation essential for survival. Farmers monitor channels, gates, and embankments carefully, understanding that neglect for even a short period can undo months of labor, turning abundance into scarcity. During peak agricultural seasons, labor intensifies dramatically, drawing entire households into the fields, as planting and harvest windows are narrow and unforgiving. Women and children contribute actively, carrying water, bundling grain, guarding fields, or assisting with processing, reinforcing the idea that farming is a collective effort rather than a specialized role. Harvesting requires coordination and endurance, as grain must be cut, gathered, and transported quickly to prevent loss, with sickles moving steadily through fields under the pressure of time and weather.
Once harvested, grain undergoes careful processing, including threshing, winnowing, and drying, each step designed to preserve as much yield as possible while minimizing spoilage. Storage becomes a critical phase of production, as grain is sealed in jars, pits, or granaries protected from moisture, pests, and theft, reflecting an understanding that survival depends as much on preservation as on cultivation. Loss during storage carries severe consequences because replacement is impossible until the next growing cycle, reinforcing vigilance and restraint in daily consumption. Agricultural surplus, when it exists, is not experienced as wealth in the modern sense, but as temporary security, often claimed partially by taxation or labor obligations imposed by the state.
The empire's presence becomes most tangible at this stage, as officials measure grain, record yields, and assign portions for state use, integrating household production into a larger administrative system without directly altering daily labor practices. Despite this oversight, farming remains deeply local, shaped by microclimates, soil conditions, and traditional knowledge, rather than centralized instruction, allowing regional variation to persist across the empire. Periods of failure are common, caused by drought, flooding, pests, or miscalculation, reminding households that control over food production is always incomplete and security fragile. In response, families diversify modestly when possible, combining grain cultivation with gardening, animal husbandry, or foraging to spread risk rather than maximize output. Animals contribute to food production indirectly through milk, traction, and manure, with meat reserved primarily for special occasions or necessity, reinforcing a diet centered on grains and plant-based foods. The labor of farming does not end with harvest, because preparation for the next cycle begins immediately, as tools are repaired, fields cleared, and plans adjusted based on experience. Winter or dry season pauses offer only partial relief, as attention shifts toward maintenance, storage management, and planning rather than rest, reinforcing the idea that farming is continuous even when fields lie dormant. For ordinary people, food production is not abstract or distant, but present in every movement, decision, and relationship, shaping the pace of life and the structure of time itself. There is little celebration in successful harvests, only quiet acknowledgement and careful management, because experience teaches that abundance is temporary and must be protected rather than enjoyed freely. As evening returns and the day's agricultural labor concludes, the fields fade into darkness without ceremony, holding the promise of future work rather than rest, while households carry the weight of responsibility inward, knowing that tomorrow's survival depends on what has been planted, stored, and preserved today.
As farming labor reveals its dependence on timing and endurance, the quiet system that makes cultivation possible comes into clearer focus, because in much of the Achaemenid world, water is not simply a natural presence, but a managed resource, whose movement, storage, and control determine whether fields live or fail. Across dry plateaus, river valleys, and semi-arid regions, ordinary people organize daily life around access to water, shaping settlement patterns, labor schedules, and social cooperation in ways that are rarely visible but constantly felt. Rainfall alone is unreliable in many areas, arriving unevenly and disappearing quickly under heat and wind, making deliberate irrigation essential rather than optional, and transforming water management into a central, shared responsibility. Canals draw water from rivers and streams, guiding it slowly across fields through channels whose paths are adjusted carefully to balance flow, prevent erosion, and ensure equitable distribution among neighboring plots. In regions where surface water is scarce, underground systems known as qanats carry water from distant sources through gently sloping tunnels, delivering a steady supply without evaporation, representing generations of accumulated knowledge rather than technological innovation in the modern sense. Maintaining these systems requires constant attention because silt builds up, walls collapse,
gates fail, and neglect quickly turns abundance into scarcity, making repair a routine obligation rather than an emergency response. Households contribute labor according to custom and necessity, sending men and older children to clear channels, reinforce embankments, or adjust gates, while women manage water use within the home, ensuring that supplies are stretched carefully across cooking, cleaning, and animal care. Water access is rarely equal, shaped by geography, seniority, and agreements established long before the current generation, reinforcing the importance of cooperation and negotiation to prevent conflict that threatens collective survival. Disputes over water are among the most serious challenges communities face because denial or diversion carries immediate consequences. Yet escalation is avoided whenever possible, as local resolution preserves stability better than appeal to distant authority. The timing of irrigation follows a precise rhythm, with gates opened and closed at specific moments to maximize absorption while minimizing waste, requiring coordination that binds neighbors into shared schedules, even when interests diverge. During planting and growing seasons, water use intensifies, drawing more labor and attention, while dry periods demand restraint and careful rationing, teaching households to think collectively rather than individually. Within the household, water shapes daily routine, as carrying, storing, and conserving it becomes an unending task, integrated into every movement rather than treated as a separate chore. Jars are filled and sealed, basins positioned strategically, and spillage avoided instinctively, reflecting an environment where waste carries tangible cost rather than abstract guilt.
Bathing remains minimal and functional, focused on cleanliness necessary for health rather than comfort, reinforcing the idea that water is valued for utility rather than pleasure. Animals depend on controlled access as well, requiring careful scheduling to prevent overuse or contamination, and reinforcing the interconnectedness of human and animal survival. Seasonal variation introduces additional pressure, as floods threaten to overwhelm channels while droughts expose their limits, requiring rapid adaptation guided by experience rather than formal instruction. When systems fail, consequences cascade quickly, as fields dry, crops weaken, and households adjust consumption downward in anticipation of scarcity, reinforcing vigilance as a constant mental state. The state's involvement in water management remains indirect, appearing through obligations to maintain infrastructure or supply labor for larger projects, yet daily control remains local, rooted in familiarity with terrain and flow. Administrative records acknowledge water systems implicitly through labor assignments and yield expectations, integrating irrigation into the broader bureaucratic framework without dictating its operation. Knowledge of water management passes through observation and participation rather than written instruction, ensuring continuity even as individual members age or disappear, embedding expertise within collective memory. Children grow up learning where channels run, how gates respond, and when flow changes, absorbing this understanding as part of their environment rather than as formal education. The physical presence of water shapes sensory experience, as the sound of flowing channels marks active seasons, while silence signals dryness or winter pause, reinforcing awareness through hearing rather than sight. Smell and touch also convey information, as damp earth signals recent irrigation, while cracked soil warns of neglect, guiding action without conscious calculation. Even rest is influenced by water availability, as midday pauses often occur near shaded channels where air cools slightly, offering relief that reinforces the centrality of water in daily comfort. At night, the systems continue quietly, water moving unseen beneath the surface or through channels, sustaining fields while households sleep, embodying the idea that survival depends on processes that never fully stop. For ordinary people, irrigation is not an achievement or marvel, but a fragile balance maintained through repetition, cooperation, and restraint, shaping life in ways so familiar that they fade into background awareness. As the day closes and attention returns to the household, water remains present in storage jars, cooling courtyards, and damp soil, silently linking labor, survival, and tomorrow's work in a continuous flow that mirrors the rhythm of life itself. As water quietly sustains fields and households alike, it ultimately flows into the most immediate and repeated act of survival, because food for ordinary people in the Achaemenid world is not a marker of identity, pleasure, or status, but a daily necessity measured by availability, effort, and restraint rather than choice. Most meals are simple, predictable, and built around grain, because bread made from barley or wheat provides the most reliable source of calories and can be prepared with limited tools and fuel, allowing households to feed themselves even when resources are scarce. Grain is ground by hand using stone tools, a slow and physically demanding process repeated daily, especially by women, whose labor transforms stored harvest into edible form through steady, practiced motion that leaves little room for variation or interruption. Bread is baked in simple clay ovens or on heated surfaces, producing loaves that are dense, coarse, and filling, designed to sustain labor rather than delight the senses, and consumed fresh whenever possible, because storage options are limited. Vegetables and legumes supplement this base, drawn from small gardens or fields and chosen according to season, adding variety only when conditions allow, reinforcing a diet shaped by environment rather than preference. In some regions, dairy products such as milk, yogurt, or cheese provide additional nourishment, valued not for richness, but for their ability to preserve nutrients across time, especially when grain supplies fluctuate. Meat is rare for most ordinary households, reserved for special occasions, religious observances, or necessity, because raising animals primarily serves purposes other than consumption, such as traction, milk production, or wool. When meat is consumed, it is shared carefully and stretched across meals, reflecting an understanding that indulgence threatens future stability rather than enhancing present comfort. Fish appears more frequently in regions near rivers, canals, or coasts, offering protein that requires less long-term investment than livestock, yet still demands skill, timing, and cooperation to obtain consistently. Fruits such as dates play a significant role in southern areas, providing sweetness and energy that can be preserved through drying, extending their usefulness beyond harvest season, and integrating them into daily consumption patterns. Beverages include beer and wine where local production allows, consumed in moderation and often diluted, serving both nutritional and social functions without becoming central to daily routine.
Water remains the primary drink, used cautiously and drawn from controlled sources, reinforcing awareness of scarcity even in the act of eating. Meals are eaten collectively within the household, not as social events, but as coordinated pauses in labor, timed to sustain energy rather than to mark the day with ceremony. Midday meals are brief and functional, often eaten near work sites or in shaded areas, allowing labor to resume quickly once heat subsides. Evening meals are slightly more deliberate, taken after the return to the household, yet still modest, as fatigue outweighs appetite and preparation time is limited by fading light. Food distribution reflects household hierarchy and labor contribution, ensuring that those performing the most physically demanding work receive sufficient nourishment to continue, reinforcing survival logic over equality. Storage practices shape eating habits significantly, as households ration supplies carefully to ensure longevity, avoiding overconsumption even during periods of relative abundance. Grain stores are monitored closely, with seals checked and quantities assessed regularly, because loss through spoilage, pests, or theft carries consequences that extend across seasons. Preservation techniques such as drying, salting, or fermenting are applied where possible, allowing certain foods to last longer and smoothing fluctuations between harvests. Cooking fuel remains limited and valuable, influencing meal choices and preparation methods, as long simmering or elaborate dishes are impractical for most households. Utensils are few and functional, often shared, reinforcing communal eating practices and reducing material accumulation. The sensory experience of food is subdued rather than intense, shaped by familiarity and repetition rather than novelty, allowing meals to blend seamlessly into the rhythm of the day. Hunger is not an occasional emergency, but a familiar presence, managed through careful planning, portion control, and acceptance, reinforcing resilience rather than expectation of abundance. Children learn eating habits early, understanding through observation when food is available, how it is prepared, and why restraint matters, absorbing these lessons as part of household culture rather than formal instruction. Illness or injury that limits labor capacity affects diet immediately, as reduced productivity forces households to adjust consumption downward to preserve future security. The state's presence appears indirectly through ration systems used to pay laborers, confirming that grain, beer, and oil are recognized as fundamental units of sustenance within the imperial framework. Administrative records listing food distributions mirror household practices, reinforcing consistency between private survival and public organization. Despite regional diversity, a shared logic governs diet across the empire, emphasizing sufficiency over pleasure, predictability over variety, and continuity over indulgence. As night approaches and the last meal of the day is consumed quietly, food fulfills its purpose without ceremony, sustaining bodies worn by labor and preparing them for rest rather than celebration. In this repetition, eating becomes an act of endurance rather than expression, grounding life in necessity and reinforcing the understanding that survival depends not on abundance, but on the careful, disciplined use of what is available.
As food sustains the body just enough to allow another day to begin, attention naturally shifts toward the forms of work that extend beyond the fields, because while agriculture remains the foundation of survival, the daily functioning of the Achaemenid world depends equally on countless non-farming tasks performed quietly and continuously by ordinary people whose labor rarely leaves visible traces in grand histories. In villages, towns, and along roads, craftsmen, builders, transport workers, herders, porters, and servants fill the spaces between harvests, ensuring that tools are repaired, goods are moved, structures remain standing, and administrative needs are met without interruption. Craft production is often small-scale and household-based, with skills passed through observation and repetition rather than formal training, allowing families to produce what they need while occasionally exchanging surplus within local markets. Potters shape clay vessels essential for storage, cooking, and transport, using techniques refined through long experience rather than innovation, producing durable objects designed to survive repeated use rather than impress through decoration. Weavers and textile workers transform wool and linen into clothing and household fabrics, a labor-intensive process that occupies long hours, particularly for women, whose work supports both domestic needs and broader economic exchange. Metal workers, though fewer in number, maintain tools, blades, and fittings, reusing materials whenever possible because metal remains valuable and difficult to obtain, reinforcing a culture of repair rather than replacement. Builders and construction laborers contribute to both private and state projects, erecting houses, storage facilities, walls, and infrastructure using mud brick, stone, and wood, guided by practical knowledge rather than architectural theory. Transport workers play a crucial role across the empire's vast distances, moving grain, materials, and goods using carts, pack animals, or human labor, their efforts largely invisible yet essential to administrative stability. Road maintenance, bridge repair, and canal upkeep require organized labor, often coordinated by local authorities, ensuring that movement and communication remain possible despite environmental challenges. State involvement in labor varies by region and task, sometimes relying on seasonal corvée obligations, sometimes on ration-paid workers recorded in administrative texts, blurring the line between private employment and public duty. Payment for labor rarely takes the form of coin for ordinary people, instead consisting of food rations such as grain, beer, wine, or oil, reinforcing the primacy of sustenance over abstract wealth. These rations are carefully calculated to support physical effort rather than comfort, reflecting an understanding that labor efficiency depends on basic nourishment rather than incentives or ambition. Women and children appear frequently in administrative records as workers, indicating that labor participation extends across age and gender lines, integrated into household survival strategies rather than separate economic categories. Children assist in crafts, transport, and domestic production from a young age, learning skills gradually through participation. their contribution valued not as training, but as immediate support for the household. Workdays are long and shaped by daylight and climate, with intense activity during cooler hours and reduced pace during extreme heat, reinforcing rhythms dictated by environment rather than policy. Breaks are brief and functional, taken when necessary rather than scheduled, allowing labor to continue steadily across the day without formal structure. Supervision varies by context, with some tasks monitored closely by overseers or officials, particularly those connected to state supply chains, while others rely on mutual accountability within small groups. The absence of specialization in many households means individuals perform multiple roles, shifting between tasks as needed, ensuring flexibility in response to seasonal or situational demands. Workspaces are often integrated into domestic environments, blurring distinctions between home and labor, reinforcing the idea that productivity is a constant condition rather than a separate activity. Tools are stored carefully and maintained regularly, as their loss or damage directly threatens the household's ability to function, reinforcing attentiveness and care as survival skills. Fatigue accumulates gradually across weeks and seasons, shaping bodies adapted to repetition rather than bursts of effort, and reinforcing endurance as a defining trait of ordinary life. Illness or injury disrupts not only individual capacity, but collective balance, forcing households to redistribute tasks and adjust expectations, revealing the fragility underlying apparent stability. Despite diversity across regions, a shared logic governs labor organization throughout the empire, emphasizing reliability, predictability, and sufficiency, rather than growth or innovation. The state benefits from this system not through direct control of every task, but by aligning administrative needs with existing patterns of work, minimizing disruption while extracting resources. As evening approaches and labor slows, tools are set aside, animals tended, and materials secured, not as a conclusion, but as preparation for repetition, because work in this world rarely ends, it merely pauses. In this continuity, labor beyond agriculture reveals itself not as an alternative to farming, but as an extension of the same survival logic, binding ordinary people into a vast, quiet system where every task, no matter how small, contributes to the endurance of daily life across the empire. As daily labor extends beyond individual households and becomes part of larger systems that bind villages, workshops, and infrastructure into a functioning whole, the question of how work is organized, recorded, and compensated quietly emerges, not as an abstract economic theory, but as a practical mechanism ensuring that ordinary people can continue working day after day without collapse. In the Achaemenid world, labor is rarely rewarded through coins for most people, because money does not yet dominate everyday life, and instead work is sustained through systems of ration distribution that directly connect effort to survival. Administrative records, particularly those preserved in the Persepolis fortification tablets, reveal a world in which workers receive measured allocations of grain, beer, wine, oil, and occasionally livestock, not as generosity, but as calculated provisions designed to maintain physical capacity. These rations vary according to age, gender, skill, and type of work,
demonstrating an early form of labor management that prioritizes functionality rather than equality. Adult male laborers performing physically demanding tasks receive larger grain allotments, while women and children receive smaller portions, reflecting assumptions about energy expenditure rather than moral value. The recording of women as textile workers, food processors, and transport assistants confirms that female labor is not peripheral but integrated into the economic system, even when confined spatially to households or workshops. Children appear in records not as dependents, but as contributors, their labor recognized and rationed, reinforcing the expectation that participation begins early and continues as capacity allows. Payment in rations creates a direct link between work and bodily maintenance, eliminating the abstraction of wealth and tying daily survival to continued participation in labor networks. Failure to work threatens not future prosperity, but immediate access to food, making labor compliance a matter of necessity rather than coercion. This system reduces the need for constant enforcement, as hunger itself becomes the primary regulator of participation, quietly maintaining order without visible force. Seasonal variation influences ration distribution, with increased allocations during periods of intense labor, such as harvest, construction, or canal maintenance, reflecting adaptability within the system. State projects rely heavily on organized labor groups, sometimes drawn from local populations obligated to contribute time rather than taxes, integrating communal responsibility into imperial administration.
These obligations, often seasonal, do not remove individuals permanently from their households, allowing agricultural cycles to continue alongside state demands. Slavery exists within the empire, but it functions alongside wage labor rather than replacing it entirely, with enslaved individuals also receiving rations to maintain productivity. Unlike later exploitative systems, the Achaemenid approach emphasizes continuity over extraction, recognizing that exhausted or starved workers undermine long-term stability. Records indicate attention to pregnant women, nursing mothers, and injured workers whose rations are adjusted, revealing a pragmatic concern for sustaining the workforce rather than compassion as ideology. Labor is often organized in groups, allowing tasks to be completed collectively while distributing physical strain, reinforcing social bonds formed through shared effort. Supervisors monitor output and attendance, but their role is administrative rather than punitive, ensuring that resources flow correctly rather than enforcing discipline through violence. The absence of widespread coin use among ordinary people limits opportunities for accumulation, preventing labor from becoming a path to upward mobility and reinforcing stability through constraint. Work remains cyclical and repetitive, with little expectation of advancement, allowing individuals to measure success not through progress, but through endurance. This structure minimizes disruption, as each person understands their place within a system that changes slowly, if at all. Even skilled laborers, whose expertise grants them some flexibility, remain bound by ration systems that prioritize subsistence over reward. The household continues to function as the primary unit through which labor is organized, recorded, and sustained, linking state administration to domestic life without replacing it. As evening approaches and rationed food is consumed, The connection between labor and nourishment becomes tangible, reinforcing the logic that tomorrow's work depends entirely on today's participation. In this way, wages in ancient Persia are not incentives for ambition, but mechanisms of balance, maintaining a workforce capable of repeating the same tasks across seasons, generations, and vast distances without collapse. When systems of labor and rationed survival fade into the background of routine, attention naturally shifts to the material layer that constantly touches the body and defines daily comfort. Because clothing in ancient Persia is not an expression of identity or status for ordinary people, but a practical barrier between fragile human skin and a demanding environment. Most garments worn by common people are made from wool or linen, materials chosen not for luxury but for availability, durability, and adaptability to regional climates that range from arid heat to cold mountain air. Wool dominates in many regions due to its insulating properties and the relative ease of maintaining sheep, while linen appears where flax cultivation and trade make it accessible, often reserved for lighter garments or underlayers. Clothing construction is simple, relying on rectangular cuts, wraps, tunics, and belts that minimize waste and allow damaged sections to be repaired without replacing the entire garment. Garments are not seasonal fashion items, but long-term possessions, worn repeatedly, patched carefully, and adjusted as bodies age or workloads change. Repair is an expected part of ownership, not a sign of poverty, and needlework becomes a constant background activity, particularly within households where women manage textile maintenance alongside food preparation and childcare. Stains, fading, and wear marks are normal features of clothing, recording the physical history of labor through frayed hems, reinforced shoulders, and thickened fabric at points of repeated strain. Footwear is basic and often absent indoors, with sandals or simple leather shoes used primarily for protection rather than comfort, and frequently repaired or reused until failure makes replacement unavoidable. The scarcity of surplus materials means clothing circulates within households, passed down from older members to younger ones, resized and reshaped to extend usefulness. This circulation reduces waste and reinforces the household as a closed economic unit where consumption is carefully regulated. Colors in everyday clothing are muted, determined by natural dyes or the absence of dye entirely, with brighter colors reserved for occasions or individuals with access to greater resources. Decoration is minimal, not because aesthetics are absent, but because time, labor, and materials are prioritized for survival rather than display. Beyond clothing, material life includes a small set of essential objects that define daily routines, such as woven mats for sitting and sleeping, clay storage jars for food, simple wooden tools, and oil lamps that extend activity into the evening. Furniture is limited, often non-existent, as daily life unfolds close to the ground, with sitting, eating, and working performed on mats or low platforms. This low-centered living reduces strain on resources while aligning the body with architectural spaces designed for shade, airflow, and ease of movement. Household objects are valued not for individuality, but for reliability, and broken items are repaired whenever possible, using techniques passed down through observation rather than formal instruction. Clay vessels are patched, wooden handles replaced, and woven items rewoven, reflecting a culture of maintenance rather than replacement. Ownership remains modest, not due to ideological restraint, but because accumulation beyond necessity creates burdens of storage, protection, and transport that outweigh benefits. The limited range of possessions simplifies daily decision-making, allowing attention to remain focused on labor, food preparation, and household coordination. Material life also reflects regional variation, as access to certain resources shapes local adaptations without altering underlying principles of reuse and restraint. In all regions, however, the body remains the central reference point, with clothing and objects designed to support movement, endurance, and protection rather than comfort or expression. As evening arrives and worn garments are folded or hung, their condition silently reflects the day's labor, preparing to be worn again without pause. Through this quiet repetition, material life in ancient Persia reinforces continuity, ensuring that ordinary people remain equipped to endure another day within systems that value persistence over change. As clothing and material surroundings quietly support the body through daily labor, the fragility of that body remains an ever-present reality in ancient Persia, because health is not understood as a stable condition, but as a temporary balance that can shift suddenly under pressure from injury, infection, exhaustion, or climate. Ordinary people live with the constant awareness that illness is not an exception, but an expected possibility woven into everyday life, shaped by physical labor, limited sanitation, close living conditions, and exposure to heat, dust, and contaminated water. Medical knowledge exists but remains unevenly distributed, relying primarily on practical observation, herbal remedies, and accumulated household experience rather than systematic theory or professional specialization. Healing practices blend pragmatic treatment with ritual behavior, not as superstition, but as an attempt to restore order when the body deviates from its expected function. Most care takes place within the household, where family members manage illness using locally available plants, oils, compresses, and rest, balancing treatment with the ongoing need to maintain food production and labor responsibilities. Rest itself is a luxury that cannot always be afforded, meaning that many individuals continue working while injured or unwell, increasing the risk of complications and prolonged suffering. Infections spread easily due to close proximity, shared tools, and limited understanding of contagion, making wounds particularly dangerous even when initially minor. Cuts, burns, and strains are common consequences of agricultural and construction work, and without effective antiseptic practices, these injuries can become life-threatening. Waterborne illnesses occur in regions where irrigation systems double as sources of drinking water, exposing communities to parasites and bacterial contamination. Childhood illness represents a significant threat, with high mortality rates shaping family structures and emotional expectations, as loss becomes a familiar experience rather than an extraordinary tragedy. Survival into adulthood is not guaranteed,
and those who do survive often carry long-term physical impairments that alter their ability to contribute fully to household labor.
Elders who remain active do so through accumulated experience rather than physical strength, adapting tasks to declining mobility while maintaining social value through guidance and oversight. Formal healers exist in some areas, offering services based on regional traditions and limited anatomical understanding, but access to such individuals is inconsistent and often restricted by distance or cost. Payment for healing services, when available, may involve goods or labor rather than coin, reinforcing the integration of healthcare into the broader system of rationed survival. Religious elements appear in healing rituals, not as abstract belief systems, but as structured responses to uncertainty, offering psychological stability when practical solutions are limited. Illness also influences labor organization as households redistribute tasks to compensate for temporary or permanent loss of capacity, demonstrating the adaptability of family-based economic units. Death, when it occurs, is treated with solemn practicality, marked by simple burial practices that emphasize continuity rather than memorialization. Grief is real, but contained, shaped by the necessity of resuming daily work and ensuring survival of the remaining household members. The presence of death within daily life reinforces a worldview that values endurance over expectation, teaching individuals to measure success not by longevity or comfort, but by the ability to persist within established routines. As night falls and bodies settle into rest, the uncertainty of health lingers, reminding ordinary people that survival depends not only on labor and resources, but on the unpredictable resilience of the human body itself. As illness, labor, and survival place constant pressure on the household, belief in ancient Persia does not emerge as spectacle or emotional escape, but as a quiet framework that helps ordinary people organize uncertainty, responsibility, and continuity within their daily routines. Because religion here is not experienced as doctrine or grand ceremony, but as repeated familiar actions embedded directly into the rhythm of work, family, and space. For most people, belief is local, practical, and unobtrusive, shaped by household traditions, regional customs, and inherited habits rather than centralized instruction or theological debate. Ritual actions occur in small domestic spaces, often near a wall niche, a hearth, or a courtyard corner, where offerings of food, drink, or simple gestures acknowledge forces believed to influence health, fertility, and stability. These practices are not performed to achieve transformation or revelation, but to maintain balance, reflecting a worldview that prioritizes continuity over change. The gods, spirits, or protective forces recognized by ordinary people are understood through function rather than mythology, associated with land, water, fire,
family lineage, and the successful repetition of seasonal labor. Religious identity does not override local customs, as the Achaemenid system allows diverse traditions to coexist, meaning that belief remains deeply tied to place rather than empire. Most rituals are conducted without witnesses beyond the household, enforcing their role as private mechanisms of order rather than public displays of devotion. Children grow up observing these practices not as lessons to be explained, but as behaviors to be repeated, learning through imitation rather than instruction. The boundary between ritual and routine remains intentionally blurred, as tasks such as lighting lamps, cleaning spaces, or preparing food carry symbolic weight without requiring explicit acknowledgement. Fire, in particular, occupies a central role in domestic life, valued for its practical necessity as much as its symbolic association with purity and protection, and maintained carefully as both resource and presence.
Belief also shapes moral expectations within the household, reinforcing obedience, respect for elders, and fulfillment of assigned roles rather than individual expression or personal conviction. Public temples exist but remain distant from the daily experience of most people, functioning more as regional landmarks than centers of regular participation. Pilgrimage and large-scale ceremonies are rare events, not recurring elements of ordinary life, and thus play little role in shaping daily behavior. Instead, religion operates as a stabilizing background system, offering explanations for misfortune and reinforcing acceptance of conditions that cannot be controlled. Ritual responses to illness, crop failure, or death do not promise reversal but provide structure during moments of vulnerability, helping households process disruption without halting necessary labor. The lack of dramatic religious performance reflects a broader cultural emphasis on restraint, where emotional access is discouraged in favor of measured response. This quiet integration of belief into daily life ensures that religion supports endurance rather than escape, allowing ordinary people to continue functioning within demanding environments. As evening approaches and lamps are lit, small gestures reaffirm continuity, linking the present day to countless similar days before it. Belief does not offer hope of change, but reassurance of order, reinforcing the expectation that life will continue tomorrow much as it did today. In this way, religion becomes not a story told aloud, but a pattern lived silently, woven into every movement, pause, and repetition of ordinary Persian life. As the day settles and the final tasks are completed, ordinary life in ancient Persia does not move toward a dramatic conclusion or emotional resolution, because for most people, existence is not structured around endings, achievements, or turning points, but around repetition that gradually becomes invisible through familiarity. There is no sense that one year marks a clear boundary from the next, no expectation that tomorrow will differ significantly from today, and no belief that life is progressing toward improvement or decline,
only the understanding that the same patterns will return again with slight variations shaped by weather, health, and chance. Families do not reflect on their lives in narrative terms because survival leaves little room for self-examination, and meaning is found not in reflection but in continuation. Children grow into adults by absorbing routines rather than receiving instruction, learning when to rise, where to work, and how to respond to authority through observation rather than explanation. Elders remain present not as storytellers of past greatness, but as living proof that endurance is possible, carrying knowledge accumulated through years of repetition rather than innovation. The empire itself remains distant and abstract, experienced through records, rations, labor demands, and occasional officials, but rarely through ideology or loyalty, as ordinary people relate not to a political entity, but to land, household, and immediate obligation. Change, when it occurs, arrives quietly and unevenly through drought, illness, migration, or administrative adjustment, rather than through events that would be remembered as history. Most lives leave no trace beyond the continuation of family lines, the maintenance of fields and canals, and the repetition of gestures that have sustained previous generations. The absence of dramatic transformation does not imply stagnation but stability, a condition valued precisely because it minimizes risk in an environment where uncertainty threatens survival. Even hardship is absorbed into routine, as illness, loss, and scarcity are expected elements of existence, rather than disruptions requiring explanation.
Death does not interrupt the rhythm of life, but is integrated into it, marked by simple practices that acknowledge loss without halting the labor required to sustain those who remain. There is no concept of retirement or withdrawal from responsibility, as contribution continues until the body no longer allows it, and even then, presence retains value through memory and example. Night does not bring reflection, but rest, as exhaustion replaces contemplation, and sleep becomes a practical necessity rather than a moment of introspection. The household closes inward as darkness settles, lamps dim, and movement slows, not as a symbolic ending, but as a pause before repetition resumes. In this quiet closure, the significance of ordinary life becomes clear, not through meaning assigned after the fact, but through persistence itself. The systems that shape daily existence do not demand belief, loyalty, or admiration, only participation, and through participation they endure. No one within this world expects to be remembered, because memory is not the measure of a life well lived, and continuity does not require recognition. What defines success is not distinction, but survival, not progress, but balance, and not change, but maintenance. As morning will return, fields will require attention, water will need to be managed, food prepared, tools repaired, and labor repeated, exactly as it has been countless times before. The end of one day blends seamlessly into the beginning of the next, forming a continuous surface of time without sharp edges. This is how ordinary life persists beneath empires, beyond rulers, and outside of recorded history, sustained not by ambition or ideology, but by routine so deeply embedded that it becomes invisible.
And in this invisibility lies its strength, because what is repeated without question is what lasts the longest.